the last couple that we've done.
Okay, cool. Let's do
All
it.
right, here we go. Good morning, everybody. I realized after I hit the button, I think for a change, I might actually be a little bit early today coming into grade school with y'all. So I hope everybody is ready for some color talk because we're going to dive right into it. Hope everyone's having an awesome week. I'm having a good week. It's a good Friday. I'm playing with colors. I'm coding up interesting tools. I'm learning new stuff. Some things are working out. Some things aren't working out. But I'm having a blast playing around. So I hope you guys are having fun adventures of your own in the world of color grading. And if not, then maybe you'll leave today's session with some new things to work on and play with. So glad y'all are all here and glad to be talking some color with y'all. My buddy Gadali is with me here. He's going to help me get everyone's questions answered. So sound in the channel whenever you've got questions that pop up. And we're going to start off today by talking about my kind of personal toolkit. I think that we made the analogy of like an MTV Cribs, which I guess is sort of a dated reference now. I assume MTV is still a channel, but I don't think Cribs is still a show. But it was a big thing when I was a teenager and younger. So I'm going to give you guys my MTV Cribs tour of kind of how I've got my Resolve world set up. Some of it will be familiar to any of you guys who were with me for the sort of live grade along that we did a few weeks ago, where we were just kind of working through a scene and talking about how I think about that stuff and work with that stuff. And then hopefully there'll be some new elements in there as well. And I might go a little bit deeper on kind of how I tackle things workflow wise as well. And then we can kind of freestyle from there. So if you guys have questions on specific things within my Powergrades as I'm showing you, feel free to ask and chime in on the chat. Or if you've got other stuff that you've been chewing on or thinking about, then happy to answer that stuff in a couple of minutes as well. So let's get into it. Let me get into my Resolve UI here. And let's start playing around. So I thought I would start today by just taking you guys through. I get a lot of questions about like, oh, well, what's going on with your Powergrades there? And I think in some of my older videos, I had some compound nodes. So I'm going to talk about the compound nodes that you may have seen in older videos as well. Just kind of give you a general tour of the things I like to have at my disposal and why and what they do inside of Resolve. And then we can answer any questions we've got about that stuff. So we talked during our session a couple weeks ago about how I set up my node tree. So I won't spend too much time on that today. But if I were to kind of like, I'll say this for starters, I build a new node tree for every single project. It's not a big lift for me because as you guys who saw my recent session, noticed I keep my node tree very spare. I try to keep it very simple. It's not that I don't ever add things to that, but you'll hear other colorists talk about how they're like, I don't want to add nodes. I want to have everything at the ready in my node graph. And that's totally valid. I just tend to think about it in kind of a 180 way where I tend to think of like, well, how many nodes can I get away with doing the grade in, and how few can I clutter my node graph with? So I do my 5 nodes or whatever. And if it gets up to 10, that's cool. But I'll also say that's like fairly rare for my workflows. I can usually get 90% of what I'm going to do on a shot, the value that I'm going to impart into that shot, is going to come from these first 5 nodes that I'm going to show you guys right now. So I'm going to label them out first, and then I'm going to make a couple other tweaks as well. So you guys saw this a couple weeks ago. I'm going to do exposure. I'm going to do a primary where I'll do overall like contrast stuff. I'm going to do a balance, BAL, or BAL we should say. And then I might do a Kelvin thing if I'm still into that. And again, this will kind of change for every project, but this is more or less what I'm going to have at the individual shot level. I might have my prime might in fact be my colloid contrast plus, which is fundamentally the same. It just has a couple of different features and aspects of it that I like to use. So those are kind of interchangeable to me, whether it's a primary or contrast plus. And then I often will put my saturation plus because this one has less of an analog inside of Resolve. What it does is kind of fundamentally different from what I would get out of the saturation knob inside of Resolve. So that's kind of like my labeled built out node tree that I'll tailor up for every project, but that's basically what it's going to look like. And then underneath that, as you guys know, I'm going to have my color, or rather wrapping around that, I should say, I'm going to have my color management and my overall look dev. So let's see what I'm doing right here with this out node. Yeah, I thought this looked a little crunchy. So I've got my output node. And this will actually be the first piece of new territory we talk about. So let's put a pin in that template node tree that we were talking about for a second, and just talk about output transforms and about one of my important power grade galleries over here called outs. So you guys have heard me talk about this before, and it's a confusing thing. At least it was for me and continues to be kind of a head scratcher, that if you take equivalent, equally sound color management solutions, I'm just going to take the two easiest, most well-known ones within Resolve, okay? Those color management solutions would be ACES and Resolve Color Management. If I create an ACES pipeline, which shepherds me from an Arri Alexa wide gamut log C source image and takes me out to Rec 709, if I create that pipeline, which by the way is more or less what I have here, I just need to make a tweak because I'm not actually input mapping yet. So let's just finish the thought that I've started here in the timeline level of my node graph, where I'm going ACES CCT to Rec 709, and let's ensure that we're properly teeing up this image by adding a node upstream. I could do this here at the clip level. If I wanted to make a group for Arri shots, I could do that as well. But I'm going to do another ACES transform here, okay? And I'm going to say Alexa into ACES CCT, which is hiding down with all of its CSC buddies at the bottom of the list, annoyingly. And then I'm just going to label this in, okay? Again, I could put this in node if I wanted to bundle all of my Alexa stuff into a group and call it Arri or call it Alexa, and then at the group pre-clip level, place this node so that it's hitting all of those images in that group very first thing up. That will be equally valid. In this case, I'm just working, I care more about building out the overall pipeline for you guys to see what I'm talking about. Again, I've talked about this before, but I feel like it bears emphasis because I think it's bloody confusing. So I now have a complete and sound and accurate pipeline within the ACES ecosystem that is shepherding me from Arri Alexa wide gamut log C all the way out to Rec 709, and I've got room carved out in the middle to grade my material in ACES CCT. Hopefully you guys are all with me on that. If you're not following what the hell I'm talking about, we've talked about color management lots and lots in grade school, and we've also talked about it in the ACES Explained series. That might be a great place to kind of initially get started if you're brand new to all these concepts. But I'm going to soldier on with the assumption that we're all generally following what's happening, and that if we're not, we can study up on our own time to fill in the blanks. So I've got this ACES pipeline built out, and let's just do an experiment. Let's grab a still, okay? I'm now going to wipe out my color management pipeline for a moment. So no more input transform and no more output transform. So now I've got this template node tree that we started building a moment ago, which we will return to. This template node tree is not actually doing anything right now. You can see I'm disabling those nodes all off and on right now. Nothing's happening because they're just labeled empty nodes at the moment. And I've also disabled all of my color management. So I'm just looking at an unprepared Arri Alexa log C image. And now let's run an experiment. Let's, instead of using ACES to do our color management, let's use Resolve Color Management to do our color management. And we're actually going to do it in one fewer step than we did ACES, because I'm going to go directly from Arri Alexa log C out to Rec 709 Gamma 24, and I'm going to grade everything in Arri Alexa log C, as opposed to grading everything in ACES CCT, which was the setup that we made a moment ago in ACES. Does that make sense? Everything's going to be in Arri Alexa log C. And I could go into my Open Effects and find a color space transform and drop it on here at the timeline level, which we all know now is going to be the very last section of my node graph. Whatever I place here is going to hit the image dead last after whatever came before it at the clip level, as well as in the group pre-clip and post-clip level. If I happen to be in a shot that has a group, this is going to be the very last section that hits the image. But in this case, I actually want to do this a little bit differently. Instead of dropping this color space transform on and manually plugging in these parameters that I'm going to use in the same basic way time and time again, I'm going to go to my Powergrades folder that I've called Outs. It's an important Powergrades folder. And if you look here, you'll see I have these different output mappings, these different solutions to get me from log C to Rec 709. These are all technically accurate solutions, but they all look a little bit different. So let's just round out the experiment that we started, and instead of manually plugging in the information that I otherwise would have just now, I'm just going to grab this power grade, log C to 709 RCM, which stands for Resolve Color Management. And I'm going to drop it on here. And this is just my stock preset for when I want to use Resolve Color Management to get from Arri LUT log C to Rec 709 Gamma 24, which is a very common occurrence, happens on most jobs I do. I just grab this power grade and drop it onto the timeline section of my node graph, or maybe the group post clip. Or if I'm wanting to grade just at the individual shot level, I can also just do it at the tail of my stack at the clip level. But this way, I don't have to go in, find a color space transform, and plug in this parameter, that parameter, and all these ones that you see down below here. They're all pre-punched in as I want them to exist. All right. So with that in place, let's just do a quick audition. We've done this before, but I think it's fun to do it again. I'm wiping to the still that I saved a moment ago when I had the same pipeline, an equivalent pipeline, I should say, teed up in ACES. So you're looking at, this is how Resolve Color Management takes me from Arri LUT log C out to Rec 709. And this is how ACES takes me from Arri LUT log C to Rec 709. So what's the deal? If they're both using color science and they're both supposedly like objective, technically sound mappings, why are we getting a different result? Well, it's that old chestnut that I go back to again and again and again, that the fundamental task we are giving to the transform when we say, take my Arri LUT log C and transform it into Rec 709 is this. Take that 10 pounds of dirt and put it into this 5-pound sack. Can't be done. No possible way to do it. All you can do is choose which 5 pounds of dirt go into that 5-pound sack. So all you're looking at when you look at the difference between the way ACES solves that problem and Resolve solves that problem is different, equally sound solutions to a fundamentally unsolvable problem, or to a problem that we cannot objectively solve because at some point, some engineer, some color scientist is going to have to make some subjective judgment calls as to what image data should be retained and what image data should be thrown away, because we're going from a big, wide, high dynamic range, wide color volume image into a much smaller dynamic range, much smaller color volume of Rec 709. So that's kind of what's going on there. And we can look at these and evaluate which one we like best. And that's really why I have this entire gallery of outs folders over here, because as I mentioned a moment ago, I will often use Resolve Color Management for my SDR transform, but I do not at all exclusively use it. So just as a couple of sort of alternative examples, we've looked at the way ACES solves this problem already. We're now looking at the way that Resolve Color Management solves this problem. Let's now look at the way Arri solves this problem. Arri has their own Arri wide gamut log C to Rec 709 transform. And if I apply this, you can see that's another option. I'm flipping in between those now. It's a different rendering, right? If I go between Resolve Color Management, here's Resolve Color Management, and there is Arri's transform. They're just different, right? It would be hard to argue if you were to audition this on a number of different shots. It would be hard to argue in a vacuum that one is just definitively superior to the other. But what you will find is if you have them all at your fingertips to audition at the beginning of a grading process, as I do, is that different transforms may serve different projects better than others. So that's why I have this outs power grade here that allows me to make that determination at the outset. What color management pipeline gets me the closest to my creative intent for this image? And the reason I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that it's a little confusing is because it's important to delineate this is not really the look. Like the look is going to come from what I do immediately to the left of or upstream of this output transform. That's where I'm really going to do the heavy lifting of articulating how I want my creative look to render the image, but this does affect the look. It does affect the rendering, and we cannot pretend that there is absolutely no aesthetic bearing on the color management pipeline we use, because as we're seeing right now, there just is. And it's confusing and it's a little like tricky to navigate, but that's just the reality. And the sooner we get used to it and get comfortable with it, the better off we're going to be as artists. And so just to round out the conversation, we can look at maybe one other one. I've mentioned this in passing a couple times, this OpenDRT project that is available on GitHub now as a DCTL that I'm a huge fan of, because this is OpenDRT, meaning Open Display Rendering Transform. And I can actually control on a more granular level the parameters of that transform, the solution to that problem of which 5 pounds of dirt from the 10-pound pile of dirt do I place into the sack? I, as the artist, can actually exert some more control over the way those decisions are made by tailoring the parameters that you see here within the DCTL. So I don't want to go completely off the rails talking about the entire universe of different solutions and transforms and ideas that we can think about when it comes to going from scene space to display space. But that's a couple of them for you, and that's why I have this very second, I should say, Powergrades gallery that contains different rendering intents. They're all technically sound. They're all set up to do the equivalent thing, but they're all implemented with slightly different solutions, which do have different effects on my image, depending on which one I use. So that was quite a tangent, but hopefully a useful one off of my main conversation about setting up my project overall. So we were talking about our node tree, and all I really meant to do at the beginning of that long diatribe was go in and set up my color management or my output transform. And in this case, I actually am going to keep it this simple with just having a single output transform from Alexa to Alexa to 709, I should say. And that's pretty common for me because I grade a lot of Alexa material. And even if I'm not grading something in Arri, I can always map into it, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But a lot of the time when it's just Arri, it turns my color management into the simplest possible form of color management I can have, which is just one transform. Just at the very end of whatever the hell else I'm doing, we're just transforming from Alexa log C into Rec 709. So anything that's already Alexa doesn't need to be input mapped. It's just good to go. So that's kind of the thinking behind some of those baseline choices that I'm making when I'm grading. And for now, let's go back to Resolve Color Management for my stock transform here. Let's go back over to our node graph where I'm just going to round out the construction of this template that I was discussing a moment ago. So I really just want to make a couple of tweaks from here. The main ones are this. When I'm in this project, when I go to my project settings and I go to my color management, if I've appropriately tagged my working color space, Arri log C, you guys who've been with me for a bit know that I tend to color manage at the node level, like I was just doing. I tend not to manage at the project level for a variety of reasons that I've explored far too much to bore you guys with anymore today. But when I'm doing that, the one thing I need to make sure I do here in the project settings is go to my timeline color space and select the working color space that I'm using. And there are a couple different reasons for that. But the one that I am most concerned with right now is this setting here is going to affect the behavior of the node when I right click on it and I say, hey, just on this node for the duration of whatever I do inside this node, I want you to map into linear and then back out. So instead of working in a log curve, I'm going to work in linear light, meaning that if I double the intensity of my gain in here, I'm going to get double the amount of light. That's actually how physical light works out there in the real world. That's why we call it linear. It's not how our eyes generally work, which is why we often don't work in linear. But there are a number of benefits to working in linear, a number of things that just work better when we are in a linear tone curve. Specifically, exposure. So I'm going to set my exposure node to linear. And same thing with my balance. I'm going to go gamma, linear. And before I round out the conversation about appropriately tagging my color space, I'm just going to show you guys this. I'm doing this sort of as an alternative to what I would really do here, which would be my colloid exposure tool. It's the same basic operation you see here. The main difference is that in my exposure tool here, if I drop my gain or increase it, I'm now getting photometric exposure, okay? The only difference that I'm getting when I do things with my colloid exposure tool is unlike in this node-based solution here, where I'm just sort of like eyeballing in a number or a setting down here that looks correct. If I want to get really precise, and if I want to have a metric that's easy to talk about with the people I'm in the room with, I can go to the exposure DCTL, and as long as I've got it set to log C, I can say, hey, why don't we try trimming a half a stop? And then if they say, wait, that's too much, I can say, oh, okay, cool. How about a third of a stop? So instead of just endlessly mousing or spinning my gain wheel around over here, it just allows for a bit more of a convenient metric for me to use in my own mind as well as in communication with my clients. But going back to the stock Resolve solution here, you guys will notice that having my gamma mapped into this linear space, first of all, nets a very different result. If I go to gamma here and I turn this back to use timeline, which is its default setting, look at the image. Things change, right? Gain in a linear tone curve versus gain in a log tone curve have very different effects. And the next thing I want to show you guys is if I flip this back to linear, And let's say for a moment that I forgot to tag my timeline color space correctly and that it's still in Rec 709 scene, which is going to be the default for a new project in Resolve. Take a look at what happens to my image. What the hell? Why did that happen? Well, what happened is that when I go in here, what's really going on when I tag a gamma or a color space in this node, the question we should all be asking ourselves when we see this feature that is admittedly quite attractive and a very easy way to round trip into other color spaces and tone curves, the question we should all be asking is, how does it know what to do? Because I'm just giving it one piece of information, linear. Well, linear from what? How do I know what I'm transforming from to get to linear? The way that Resolve knows what it's transforming from is by observing the timeline color space setting. So if I look here at my timeline color space, the reason why this changed and the reason why it no longer is going to work well for me is that the operation that a moment ago was Arri log C to linear, Cullen makes his exposure adjustment, and then the node on the back end goes from linear back out to log C so that we're ready to do whatever other grading in log C we want to in the node graph. That's what I had a moment ago. Now my round trip is Rec 709 to linear, whatever adjustments Cullen makes, and then linear back out to Rec 709 in terms of the tone curve. The problem is those are not valid transforms because I'm not in Rec 709, am I? I'm in Arri log C. So that's why we see that change there. And that is one of the 3 reasons why we want to be very mindful of properly setting this timeline color space setting in accordance with what we're actually doing in our node-based color management. Because if we don't, there's going to be a couple of ripple effects like this one that bite you in the butt when you're not paying attention and at the moment you least need or expect it. So that's why I've got that set up that way. And so for exposure, you've seen when I flip between linear and log, totally different effects. But when I'm in linear, I'm getting photometric exposure. And then with balance, same kind of thing. This is going to give me, even though red, green, and blue are not the exact native language of physical light, they're not a bad analog for the different wavelengths of light out there in the real world. And to my hands, it just feels, let's reset our exposure node over here. To my hands, balance just feels better done in linear. It's a little bit less touchy. I can drive the wheel a little bit harder. And this is essentially the equivalent of using my offset when I'm in log, just like my gain here in this exposure knob is roughly the equivalent of using my offset when I'm in log over there. But they are not actually identical. They're not the same. And this is the purer, better version of things as opposed to doing things in log. So that's just a couple tweaks. I talked about those, I think, in a little bit less detail when we did our little grade along exercise a few weeks ago, but figured I would recap those for you guys in terms of how I initially set up my node graph. What you're looking at right now is a variation on a node graph that I'm always going to build some version of at the outset of a project. And then once I've got it built, I'm going to make sure that I have node 1 selected. Then I'm going to select every single clip in my timeline, and I'm going to apply that grade from shot number 1 onto all of these other shots, or excuse me, from shot number 7, because that was where I built out that node tree. And I'm going to apply it to all my other shots so that, let's say this is not a timeline of random test material that I use to demo things out for you guys, but this is an actual timeline of edited content that I need to grade. Now, every time I land on a new shot, I've got the same template node tree, and I've already got my exposure node highlighted, which is always going to be the first node that I work on. I'm always going to work from left to right when I'm grading through a timeline. Start with the exposure, then work on your ratio using your primary. I'm only going to do contrast pivot or lift and gain here in this node. I'm not going to make exposure. I'm just going to mess with the ratio once I've got exposure dialed in. Balance we just talked about. I'm either creatively or correctively going to change the ratio of red to green to blue in that balance node. Kelvin, if I feel like doing a temperature thing, this is where I would do it. I would do it using my HDR zones palette, which brings us to the second of the 3 implications of the selection of our timeline color space here. This is also going to affect the behavior of things like the temp knob in my high dynamic range palette. So if I have that setting properly flagged, that means that my temp knob is going to give me something close to photometric temperature adjustment inside of this node. And then finally, this SAT plus tool that I threw in just for fun. Let's go to shot number 6 here just as an example. and take a look at the way this tool works if I want to add some saturation into my image. I can do straight saturation here. This knob really is just a one-to-one for resolve saturation knob. But the thing that I use as its companion nearly every time I break this tool out is this color density slider, which is going to increase the darkness or the density of my more colorful hues in the frame, so that I'm going to get more of a kind of a film-like saturation as opposed to a video saturation where as I add color, I also am adding luminance. With film, the opposite is true because of the subtractive nature of a film print. As you add color, you have no choice but to lose luminance. So sometimes implementing saturation in that way can be aesthetically desirable. And while there are ways to do it from within Resolve, it's far easier for me to just have a knob for myself at the ready here within the Saturation Plus tool. So, recap on construction of a template node tree, how I apply it across all of my shots, what is going on with my outs power grade, and then I want to show you all one more thing, and then I'll take a quick breath and we can answer any questions that have popped up. So here in my ins node, very similar concept to my outs. The idea is that no matter what input source I've got, at least my usual suspects, I've got them here at the ready so that I don't have to manually create color space transforms and plug in values that I use over and over again. One of the most common instances is I get a Rec 709 shot that I still want to tee up into my normal color managed pipeline. So I've just got presets saved for that. Maybe I'm working in DaVinci Wide Gamut, in which I've got a preset transform to take me from 709 into DaVinci Wide Gamut. These are all color space transforms so that I can control some of the parameters within there. I can control my max input and max output and my input gamma curve until I find something that works reasonably well. That is to get me into DaVinci Wide Gamut. I also have one for log C. And then I've just got some basic utility ones to get from, let's say I'm actually grading in DaVinci Wide Gamut and I've got log C source material. I've got a transform ready for that. Grading red, or I have red source material, but I'm grading DaVinci Wide Gamut. I've got a preset for that. So on and so forth. That's what these are all about, is these are just really common, kind of usual suspects that I like to have at the ready because they're the most common things that I go to over and over again, and I just get tired of flipping through menus and manually selecting stuff. So more stuff to show you guys, but let me take a quick breath for air and see if we got any questions out there, Gadali.
All right. Jim was wondering, when you were comparing the various ins, why are you not comparing the resolve management at the project level to ACES? It seems the parameters below the transform can make a huge difference. Wouldn't that change things?
Yes, absolutely. So that if we want to get even more granular, we can observe that unlike ACES, where it's like, hey, ACES CCT to 709, there's a single solution over which we have no control. Within Resolve Color Management, as Jim points out, in our project settings, if I were to flip over to project level Resolve Color Management to use an awkward turn of phrase, and go down here to custom, you'll see there's a whole universe of options here that go above and beyond what's your input, what's your working, and what's your output color space. We've got a timeline working luminance. That sounds fancy. And we've got an input DRT and an output DRT. And as Jim observes, all of these are going to impact the reproduction of your image. And I would encourage all of you guys to play around with those and get familiar with them and choose the ones that best support your creative agenda, whether that's a fixed thing or whether it changes per project. But to directly answer Jim's question, the reason why I don't dive into this menuing and look at all of the possibilities, because there are hundreds of potential combinations of settings that I could break out here, I've done that plenty over the years, and I've arrived at the following formula. Within Resolve Color Management, these are the settings that I like to get from Arri Alexa to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 using Resolve Color Management. I use luminance mapping. I have a max input of X. I have a max output of Y. My adaptation here has been dialed in to preserve middle gray at a place where I think it should be for a 709 rendering. My saturation compression is where I want it. This is all dialed into exactly what the best combination of these settings for my eye within Resolve Color Management. Now, is it possible that I might find a different ideal combination of those settings within Resolve Color Management for a particular project? Possible, yes. That's more granular than I end up getting. I'm usually pretty happy to just go through the tire kicking exercise of trying on these various solutions as opposed to playing around within them. And just to make things even more complicated and hopefully a little more interesting, within Resolve Color Management, the other option we have at our disposal, somewhat confusingly, but also potentially of advantage to us, is that we can actually render our output. We can borrow, I think I used the red IPP2 transform a moment ago. We can actually invoke that from within Resolve Color Management. So we can say, hey, Resolve Color Management, even though I'm using you for some of my transforms, I want you to whole cloth steal red IPP2's solution for getting from scene space to display space. And I want to be clear with these. When I start talking about red's solution or Arri's solution, I'm not talking about a solution that just works for Arri or just works for red material. You could use this red IPP2 output DRT no matter what your image started as. This is just a solution that red have come up with for getting from scene space to display space, not a solution they've come up with for getting from red to display space specifically. And same thing with Arri's tool. That's just a algorithm that happens to come in the form of a LUT that happens to expect Arri Alexa log C. But if I like the way that the Arri solution for getting from display or from scene space to display space rather works, there's no reason I can't tee up in front of this node a second transform that takes me from, let's say, I want to work in DaVinci wide gamut, but I like the way that Arri takes me from scene space to display space. I could do this. Where is that DaVinci intermediate? I could go Arri Alexa, Arri log C, all this junk turned off. And I am now mapping, if I turn off whatever else was going on at my timeline level, I'm now mapping from a working space. If I was truly working in DaVinci wide gamut, which I'm actually not at the moment, and that's why my image looks a little bit funky. But if I had decided on and was working within DaVinci wide gamut leading up to this point in my chain, I could use Arri's solution for scene space to display space simply by teeing up Arri Alexa log C for that LUT immediately upstream of it to the left. And if that's complicated or you don't exactly understand it, that's okay. It just is complicated and it's confusing. But I point all this stuff out because the truth is it's all variables for us to try to slowly bite off and understand and control the different aspects of in order to arrive at creatively optimal solutions. So very long answer to Jim's question, but he brings up a great point that we can really tailor our Resolve Color Management setting, which is in fact one of the things I like most about Resolve Color Management. I just happen to have found a particular set of parameters within there that consistently serve my creative needs when I choose to use Resolve Color Management. Let's see what other questions we got out there.
Zach wants to know, can you talk about broadcast legal? How do you go about making sure everything is safe upon finishing grading?
Yes. So broadcast to legal, the cool thing is that there's two aspects of that to talk about. The first aspect is, are you properly targeting and inhabiting the Rec 709 tone curve and primaries container? The good news is there, if you're color managing soundly, we don't need to worry about that. That's just what color management is. As long as you don't do a node to the right of your 709 output and say, hey, I think in the 11th hour, I could use some extra juice and I want to do it downstream of my output transform. If I start doing junk like this, I may or may not be getting a broadcast safe Rec 709 gamut, if you will. I may be reaching outside the bounds of what's acceptable for Rec 709. In fact, I almost certainly am. But as long as I have sound color management and I'm working inside of that color management, I don't need to worry too much about my tone curve or about my gamut. In fact, I don't need to worry at all. The only thing that's left at that point is a scaling question of like, all right, do you want me to scale my levels to what we call full or video levels? Sometimes we call video levels legal levels. The idea there is that we should think about you. For those of you guys who've heard the term before, the best way to think about this is like by default, everything is full all the time, and we shouldn't think about legal levels at all unless someone is paying us to think about them, because they're a complete artifice and they have no role to play, no beneficial role to play in creative color grading. Now, if you have a vendor who's requiring you deliver that, you should be able to deliver that. So what is a legal tone range? What is a legal level? All that means is if we imagine a 10-bit scale, okay? So 0 being pure black, 1023 being pure white. So if I wanted to target pure white with an RGB triplet in 10-bit, I could say 1023, 1023, 1023. So red, green, blue, all at 1023, which would give me white, right? And that would give me the absolute highest value that I am capable of targeting inside of a 10-bit container. All that we're doing when we say legal is we're saying, oh, the ceiling is actually not 1023. The ceiling is inside of that 1023. And to be honest with you guys, I don't even remember what the scaling is. I think it's maybe 10% top and bottom. So that would be 1023 minus 102.3, whatever the hell that comes out to. That's now your ceiling. And anything above that is illegal, quote unquote. That's why we call it legal levels. All this means is that on the top, you are setting a ceiling 100 code values or so below the actual code value ceiling. And at the bottom, you're setting a floor 100 or so code values above the actual ceiling of the container. And there's all kinds of technical reasons for that we don't need to concern ourselves with too much, except to say that that's a thing still. Occasionally, we're going to get asked to deliver material in that legal scale, and we simply need to target it accordingly, ideally by simply working that way from the beginning. So in our master settings here, monitoring in video as opposed to full levels. And then when you deliver over here, simply leaving your, under your advanced settings, your data levels to auto. You really don't want to explicitly change these. You just want to leave them auto because they are going to follow whatever you had set up in your project settings and whatever you were looking at on your reference monitor. So that's the easiest way to think about that. Is like, all right, if you want video, I'm going to set my data levels to video in my project settings, and I'm going to render it out that way. If you want full, I'm going to set my data levels to full. I'm going to monitor in full, and I'm going to render in full. But that's what those terms mean. Video means that we are taking the top and bottom 10% or so. I wouldn't swear to that figure, but 10% or so out of the equation. We're saying nothing can live in the bottom 10% of this container, nor can anything live in the top 10%, versus legal, where we say, hey, let's use the room, man. Let's bump right into the walls if we want to. Anything between 1023 is fair play. So I hope that helps. Let me show you guys some more stuff, and then we'll take a few more questions. All right, so we've talked about building out a template node tree. We've talked about a couple of my Powergrades up here. Let's take a look at another one of my Powergrades folders here. This is what I call my Toolbox, which is just kind of like a random smattering of stuff that I use quite a bit. So one thing that I can show you guys that might be of interest is I've come up with a transform based on some pretty thorough analysis of, like, let's say, let me give you a practical, let's give some practical parameters to a hypothetical job. So I'm doing a job, and I know I'm mastering in Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 on the monitor to my right. And that's what I'm aiming at. This monitor is calibrated. I'm targeting that display standard, and everything is happy. It looks great to me. It looks great to my clients in the room. But we've got that old chestnut of wanting to get the best possible reproduction, the best possible perceptual match to what we all love in the grading environment out in the real world on all kinds of different devices, and namely for the web. So I've devised this transform. That's the first transform up that you'll see here that gives me a good perceptual match based on analysis and charts that I've run through various pipelines of encode and upload and looking at what I get back from that process, so that I do this web viewing, and this is going to give me a slight tweak to my image that's going to make it, it's going to cause what I see right now on my reference monitor without this turned on. When I turn this on, I will have a tighter match on my sRGB-ish GUI computer monitor. I will now have a tighter match to what I was looking at a moment ago on my reference monitor, if that makes sense. So when I turn this on, my reference monitor is no longer reliable because I'm doing stuff that my reference monitor doesn't want or need, but I'm getting a tighter perceptual match for stuff like a viewing QuickTime, which is really important, especially in the time that we're living in right now, where we do tons and tons of remote review. I want everyone to see as close to what I see as possible. So that's what this little stack is all about. It's just targeting that in a pretty scientific way that I've done via analyzing outputs and encodes and the net result of what that looks like in a browser when it's in frame IO or whatever, and then applying some reverse engineering so that I can get that. I can compensate for what that system is going to do to the image and get a net neutral rendering or close to it, so that when my clients look at a view in QuickTime, they see what I'm seeing on my reference monitor, or as close to that as possible. So that's part of my toolbox. I've talked with you guys, maybe not on in grade school before, I can't remember, but I've talked about this LMS model. I mentioned a moment ago how balancing, even when we're in linear, red, green, and blue is not exactly a perfect analog for the way wavelengths of light work out there in the real world. LMS is interesting because it's just a color model that allows us to manipulate things in what we can call a perceptually uniform way. So now instead of, within this LMS sandwich, instead of manipulating red, green, and blue, I'm manipulating long, medium, and short wavelengths, which correspond with the sensitivities of my eye. So we are going to get a perceptually uniform feeling adjustment when I spin my wheels around in my gain section here. It's just something fun that I like to play around with that I feel like gives me slightly more intuitive and linear response when I'm adjusting my ratio of red to green to blue, simply by moving it into what we can call a perceptually uniform color model, if that makes sense. And some usual suspects here. You guys have seen my, we've talked about my halation stack before. We can look at this synthetic print tool that I've probably talked with you guys about, at least in passing. This is where my creative contrast is usually coming from, and I've got other pieces in here as well, but I'm just going to focus on this curve for now. This is sort of like the heartbeat of my creative look that I might deploy here inside of Resolve Color Management, and you can see it's kind of already dialed into a pretty nice looking baseline just by the default parameters within it. But like, this is a huge part of where I'm going to like define my look for a given project, is just by dropping an instance of this synthetic print curve onto the tail of my stack. And I'm 9 times out of 10 going to define my look using this tool, as opposed to a LUT or curves here in Resolve, or some other method that I might choose for look dev. It's just a tool that I've spent lots and lots of time developing to give me all the control plus all the constraint that I want as I'm trying to develop a creative contrast curve per project. And you can see when I turn this curve on here, this is the net of my curve. So it's got a swooping, rolling behavior here. It's got a ceiling that's lower than the top floor. It's got a floor that's higher than the bottom floor. And it's got some biasing of cool into the bottom and warm into the top. And it just allows me to quickly dial things in as my sort of baseline of my creative grade that I'll add stuff on top of as well. But that's a good start. And geeky note for anyone who is interested, this engine that you see here, all these complicated arguments in here, this is actually what underlies the colloid print tool. All that this, when I load up colloid here and I look at FP1, all that FP1 is a big long list of arguments that get passed to that synthetic print curve and a number of other transforms that are basically presets for saying, hey, I want you to run the image through this series of processes using this set of predetermined settings that I've dialed in to taste. And FP2 is simply a different recipe for those same parameters, those same controls as with FP3. So that's the idea there. So sometimes I'll use the colloid print. Sometimes if I want more control than just 4 sliders, I'll go back to the actual underlying engine and roll something custom for myself at the beginning of a project. And let's see if there's anything else I want to show you in the toolbox. Yeah, that's plenty of stuff there. And then just to round things out in my Powergrades, some usual suspects here that you guys have probably also seen me use or talk about before. I've got middle gray, log C middle gray, because again, that's my stock working color space. This is just a really handy way for me to look at where a particular process is moving middle gray. Like, this is a total arbitrary example, but let's say that I did choose to make a creative contrast curve right inside of Resolve, okay, using my curves tool. You guys have seen me do this before. And I wouldn't be doing this curve with that made gray in there. I would just be looking at my image and saying like, all right, I want to do, you know, X, Y, Z, whatever combination of adjustments that end up giving me a favorable kind of visual result. Let's say that I love that, just as an example. What I can do with this 18% gray is I can see what does this process, in this case, just this one curve node that I've drawn, what does this process do to middle gray? because I generally speaking, at least at the beginning of a project, want to be mindful of whether I'm moving middle gray or not. And now you can see when I turn middle gray on, it's occupying a single horizontal line in my waveform. And if I flip this curve off and on, you can see whether or not I'm moving middle gray. And I've got the touch today because I'm actually not moving it very much. But if I set these parameters in the wrong way, you can see it's quite easy to move middle gray off of where it started. And that can be helpful feedback for me creatively to say like, well, can I get what I like out of this curve that I drew, but preserve middle gray such that I'm not objectively bumping exposure up or down with this global look that I'm creating. Ultimately, I'm not afraid of moving exposure if that's what the creative agenda of the project is, but I want to know when I'm doing it, and I rarely want to bake it in there without even realizing like, oh, I drew a curve that I liked, but I also biased exposure down a third of a stop or whatever. I generally want to be conscious of that and also in dialogue with my clients about that, as opposed to just grabbing it, as opposed to like letting it sneak in unawares, if that makes sense. And the last thing I'll show you guys in this miscellaneous toolbox would be my exposure chart, which is sort of aimed at a similar thing. It's a way of getting kind of a reality check on something that I've done. Let's say, again, just for the sake of argument, I'm wanting to get a reality check on the way the curve that I've drawn is affecting an exposure chart. So if I go to my parameters for this exposure chart, you can see I've defined middle gray and I've said how many stops total I want to see above and below middle gray. So in this case, that's 16, 8 to the left and 8 to the right, or maybe 8 to the left and 7 to the right. I can't remember. But I'm looking at how does this process visually affect my tone scale here, and just confirming like, okay, so here's what happens by the time I get, let's simplify the chart a little bit and say that we're just going to look at, I don't know, like 3 stops above and below, like so. So I've still got middle gray here. And so in fact, I'm only looking at 2 stops above. Let's go to 7. So I'm looking at a full 3 stops. So I've got gray and then a stop over that, 2 stops over that, 3 stops over that. So I can actually see as I increase this under my curve, where is the point where my roll starts to make 2 patches indiscernible from one another. And I can just kind of conclude like, okay, so even though I know there are patches there, I can't tell the difference anymore by the time I'm looking at 7 or 9. And that's just something interesting for me to know that like, hey, with this curve at that strength, you are compressing your highlights such that they are indiscernible from one another by the time you get to 3 stops over mid-gray or 5 stops over mid-gray, and just have that be useful information for myself and for the people I'm working with, that like, hey, this is one of the sort of like effects or net results of this creative look we've developed is if you've got something that's 4 stops over your middle exposure that you want to see detail on, you're not going to see detail on it unless we pull it back in underneath that creative contrast curve. So just some other fun gizmos there that I keep at the ready because I use them quite a lot, usually at the outset of a project. A lot of these tools are things that I'm going to like kind of break out at the beginning of a project and either incorporate into my overall node graph or just have at the ready so that I can audition them when I'm doing look dev or at some point during the process. Let's take some more questions.
Okay, Martin wants to know, when color managing, how do you decide whether to work in Arri wide gamut versus DaVinci wide gamut versus ACES? Is it simply preference?
There's a couple of factors there that you want to be mindful of. Really, the main one is that thing that we started our conversation with today, that if you're in ACES, unless you are using Resolve Color Management to get in and out of ACES, which would be kind of an unusual choice, if you're in ACES, the biggest implication of choosing ACES is that you are marrying yourself, at least in most cases, to the ACES rendering transform, to the way ACES solves that problem of scene to display, which we talked about before. There are other ramifications as well, but that's the biggest one, is like there are certain color spaces that sort of imply a color management solution. So if I say ACES CCT, that means I'm working in an ACES pipeline and I'm using the ACES solution to get out to 7 or 9. If I like that solution, great. If I don't, that's probably not the right choice. Others like DaVinci Wide Gamut versus Arri Log C, those are both color spaces that you're probably going to use inside of Resolve Color Management in Resolve, unless you're using a less available kind of third-party solution like some of these ones that I was showing you over here. So at that point, it just becomes about the technical specs of those containers, which are different. But I would argue the distinction between Arri log C wide gamut versus DaVinci wide gamut intermediate is really not something that we need to be concerning ourselves with as colorists in 2021. If we want to be future-proofed and buttoned up and never worry about it again, DaVinci wide gamut intermediate would actually be the safer bet. Although you run into issues there where DaVinci wide gamut intermediate is a much less common exchange format. So then you've got to worry about handing things off to vendors with a transform into a more common color space and receiving things back from them that then need to be input mapped back into DaVinci wide gamut. But all things being equal, DaVinci wide gamut intermediate is the largest color volume, highest dynamic range of any of the working color spaces. So if you wanted to know that you're never going to have to think about it again in terms of having sufficient color volume and dynamic range, that would be your optimal choice. But honestly, the distinction between that and something like Arri log C really is not, you're never going to notice or feel the difference as long as you are setting up equivalent and sound color management around whatever that working color space is.
And how would you create 18% gray for another gamma or log format?
Well, you could do it a couple different ways. The geeky way that if you guys are interested in this, you can leave some comments on the show afterwards. What you would want to do there is you would want to take 18% gray linear, which is literally a 0.18, and map it into, use the log encoding formula of, or gamma encoding formula of whatever curve you're trying to model. So the way that I got Arri log C 18% gray, like if I look at this exposure chart that I was showing you guys, what that's doing under the hood is it's starting with a 0.18 in all cases, or it's actually starting with whatever I set this value to, which defaults to 0.18, and then it is running that value through Arri's published encoding curve for log C. Then if I move it to ACES CCT instead of through Arri's published encoding curve for log C, it's running it through the Academy's published encoding curve for ACES CCT, and you'll see that mid-gray actually moves in that case. It's even easier to see if I set my total steps to 1 here, so I'm just looking at that mid-gray, and I'll turn the ramp off. You'll see mid-gray plots in different places for different tone curves. So the geeky answer is to run it through the actual encoding curve, the actual formula that gets used for those different tone curves. And what I was saying a moment ago is if you guys are interested, leave a note leave a comment on the video, and I'll consider sharing I have a spreadsheet that I've built out that's very excitingly called middle gray encodings that simply takes an input value of whatever you punch in and gives you what that equivalent value is in Arri log C or S log or C log or whatever you're trying to find the correct value for. What else we got?
Tiago is curious, why do clips which have a bigger color space than Rec 709 in a Rec 709 timeline actually look flat and desaturated instead of looking clipped and oversaturated?
Yeah, very good question. It's difficult to answer in a succinct and simple way, but it's because those values are they're occupying the same range. So if I look at, think about it this way. If I want to represent to you for a Rec 709 color space, let's take tone curve out of the mix for a minute completely. And let's just talk about the triplet values for a given color in a given color space. What is the triplet value for red in Rec 709? It's 1, 0, 0, right? The triplet value actually doesn't change except depending, I guess tone curve does come into play a little bit, but it's a question of the way that those same values are interpreted by the display. So because they are interpreted in different ways, like they're being misinterpreted basically. If I send 100% red in Arri wide gamut, the display is going to misinterpret that as the wrong color basically, because it doesn't have the ability to reproduce on that scale. So I was in my thought experiment just now trying to kind of take tone curve out of the mix, but it's tough to do. I mean, let's just do let's do an experiment here and say let's say that this red on this color checker is reasonably, it's not 100% red, but it's close. And let's say we want to go from Alexa log C into linear, just to make this a little bit easier to compare. And if we look at our vector scope, let's just see what happens if we go from Alexa log C to Alexa linear and compare that to Rec 709 linear. We are getting more saturation in Rec 709 versus in Arri Alexa because those code values are occupying more of the container, if that makes sense. I don't feel like I'm answering this question in a great way, to be honest with you. It confuses me too, but as we probably all know, going into the question, the fundamental reason and really the only thing we need to understand about that is that RGB triplet values are only as useful as their correct interpretation. So if we have a set of values, say 100, pure red, unless we know how to interpret that 100, it can mean a million different things, and only one of them is correct, if that makes sense. So the moment that we are sending a 100 that is not that the display doesn't know how to interpret, in the case of sending it Alexa log C, Alexa log C's encoding for 100% red, the display is not going to interpret that correctly because it's expecting to get those values on a scale of Rec 709. That's not a perfect answer, but that's like the broad correct answer to think of it as, is that the RGB triplets are only as good as their correct interpretation. What else we got?
How do you set up or organize your databases and the projects within them?
Yeah, so that one's pretty simple. I sort of have two things going at any one time in my database. I've got jobs like actual, client jobs who, like clients who call and book time and have delivery specs and estimates and invoices and all this fun stuff that comes with, actually delivering professional work. And then I also have a whole catch-all of just other stuff that I'm doing, some of which is it's course development or my own workshop you see here, or grade school or whatever we're doing. So that stuff all lives in here, and then actual paying jobs live within there, like so. So that's the easiest thing. And then within those jobs, I have job numbers that are a boring convention of running a business that are like, it starts with the last two digits of whatever year we're in. And then on January 1st, 2022, job number 1 will be 22001. And then the next one will be 22002. And that's the labeling system that I use for the projects in my database, for the projects in my hard drive where all the media and assets for a given job live. And it's really as fundamentally simple as that. And then I periodically, probably I'm trying to think. I'm on a shared database that is being run on a dedicated Mac Mini that just sits here all day and does nothing but run the database. And it does nightly backups, so it's backing itself up. Actually, I take that back. It is hourly backups that live for a 24-hour period. So at any given time, I can go back in time in 1 hour increments up to 24 hours backwards in case I delete a project or a project gets corrupt or whatever. That's just kind of like my backup cadence there. But I don't think there's much else I can tell you about the project database. It's pretty simple. Just job numbers, a jobs subfolder for paying jobs that helps delineate those things from my own pursuits, whether that's course development or my workshops or just other stuff that I'm doing not for an external client necessarily. And then just having, in this case, a shared database, but just in general, a database that has a system in place for backing itself up so that I'm never in the nightmare scenario that I've been in before. And I hope you guys haven't been in and are never in, of like, oh, crap, I just deleted the wrong project, or that project is somehow corrupt and it won't open for some reason. All those kind of things that are not common these days, but they can definitely happen. So that's the other piece of that.
Douglas asks, you mentioned people tend to prefer Arri's color science because of the research development that Arri did for their transform, would it be sound to use their LUT for that reason?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I do. I'll say like, I don't know. I like the Arri LUT. Like, let's compare it. That's the difference between Arri's answer to scene to display rendering versus Resolve Color Management. They're similar. The tone curve is quite similar. Like, if we wanted to get a more objective view on it, we could go to one of the members of my miscellaneous gallery here and throw a ramp up underneath it and look at the waveform and say like, oh, okay, so that's what Arri's shape looks like of their curve. And there's what Resolve Color Management's look like. They're very similar. It comes down in this case more to the color rendering to my eye. I think I prefer Resolve Color Management just by a hair, but kind of like we talked about before, this is always so confusing to me because it's like, I don't really want to get lost in the weeds of like confusing this with my look dev, because this isn't my look dev. My look dev is my look dev. However, the best way, I suppose, to think about this is I'm looking at this less in terms of like, what does this do in isolation, but I'm looking at it in the context of what does it provide for, what kind of like workspace does it give me for the application of my creative look, which just takes noodling around and getting a feeling for like, how does creating a look under this versus creating a look under one of these other solutions, how do those feel and what are the net results to me? And just from all of that trial and error that I've done over the years, I've arrived at, for the most part, being pretty darn comfortable with Resolve Color Management as like a stock DRT, but also being very unafraid of like playing around with others and being sensitive enough to like the needs of a project that like, I'll give you guys a probably oversimplified example, but if I'm getting a sense early on in the project, either from explicit language or just from picking up on clues or early notes that I'm getting from a client, that they want to go for a less primary and more sort of pastel-y rendering, a less popping rendering of their colors, I will certainly stay away from aces in that case to the extent that I was ever considering it, which is not often. And I will probably stay away from Resolve Color Management too, because if you look at the difference on like this frame that has lots of high saturations in it, look at the difference between Resolve Color Management and Arri in this case. You can look at it on the scopes too. They're quite different. And you can even see my reds are sort of like swinging more yellowy here than they were here. Everything is a little bit more compressed and angled up toward that primary fire engine red. So it's just properties and values of these different DRTs that I like enjoy thinking about and enjoy like at the outset thinking like, well, if every time I land on a shot that has red contents, I'm hearing the note that they're like, oh, that red is too much, back it off. I, of course, can solve that in my look dev, and if not there, then at the local shot level. But if I'm picking up on it as a broad overall note, that's probably going to cause me, even if I don't say anything to the client, I'm probably not going to talk with the client about this because honestly, I'm talking to you guys about it. You guys are all showing up to hear me talk about color grading for an hour. You care at least a little bit about these kind of details. The client is generally, they don't care and they're a little overwhelmed by this stuff. You guys may be a little overwhelmed by it. I know I am sometimes. So it's generally not something I'm going to talk about with the client, but I will, in anticipation of what they're talking about, or even just auditioning without explaining at a granular level what's happening, I might say after, let's say we've had 5 notes now where we've landed on a shot, they've said, whoa, easy on the red, buddy. I might at that point say, oh, that's interesting. I've noticed that we've kind of had that pop up a couple times. Let me ask you something. Let me show you something. And I'll say, let's take a look at this. And I'll ask, does that feel like a better baseline on this shot? And if they say yes, I'll go, okay, let's try something. Let's go back to a couple of those other shots where we had that note. And I'll audition for them, again, without necessarily explaining what I'm doing unless they press and they really want to understand. And I'll just audition and be like, all right, what do you think? Here's where we left this shot a moment ago. And here's what I'm pitching to you now. What do you think? Do you like number 2 better? And I'll go through that 3 or 4 or 5 times. And if we pick up on a pattern, then that might be the way that I would sort of collaboratively implement that strategy change in terms of our like macro level color management without getting into the weeds with the client of saying like, well, as you may know, there are these different forms of color management and they're going to render technically sound, but different image reproduction depending on the ones you choose. People don't want to hear that. Generally speaking, some folks might. But generally speaking, I'm going to try to find a very simple, just visual way of saying like, hey, what do you think, this or that? What do you like better? And just kind of approach it like that from a more visual, kind of tactile, intuitive framework. What else? We're getting close on. Oh, well, man, we're there again. Let's do one more. Give me a great one, Gadali. No pressure.
Oh man, pressure is on. Let's see. Kind of changing gears a little bit. I hear some colorists adjust printer lights before any luma exposure and contrast nodes because apparently colors will ease better. Any thoughts on that?
Let's see. So let me hear that question. I'm actually going to scroll up and look for it here. It's one of those ones that puts my brain into a knot. Okay, so I heard some are adjusting printer lights before any luma exposure and contrast because apparently the colors will ease better. Any opinions? That's an interesting question. And I would say, to give a complex answer, it depends a little bit on what you're grading underneath. If you are grading underneath a film emulation in particular, then yes, the position of your exposure is going to have quite a bit of effect on your RGB balance. You could also state that in the exact opposite terms, which is kind of the way that the question was asked of like, well, my RGB balance is going to change depending on where my exposure is setting. You can kind of, they're going to influence one another. Exposure going up or down is going to change where your hues and ratios park in terms of red, green, and blue. And red, green, and blue are being changed can change like the sort of perceptual weight or contrast ratio of the image. So you can kind of think about it in either direction, to be honest. I tend toward the school of thought that says, just going back to biology, and you guys have heard me talk about this before probably, if we think about the hardware of our eyes as human beings, we have two types of photoreceptors in our eyes. We have rods and we have cones. Rods are responsible for the detection of changes in luminance and contrast. Cones are responsible for perceiving color, red, green, and blue, or long, medium, and short, as we talked about before. There are far more rods in our eyes than there are cones, okay? So what that means is that just as a fixed limitation of our hardware in our eyes, and everything that we do in color is about human vision. We're not grading for dogs or mantis shrimp or any other species with different vision. We're grading for humans. We are far more sensitive to changes in luminance in contrast than we are to changes in color. So that causes me on a number of axes to always be prioritizing exposure and contrast. And I'm always kind of thinking about like, you know, what if a rock fell out of the sky in my first 15 seconds of grading this shot? Will those first 15 seconds have been the best? Will I have spent those first 15 seconds in the very best way possible for the goals of this image, if that makes sense? And in that spirit, I like to start with exposure and contrast because that's simply going to make a bigger difference to the visual experience than the RGB balance will. And because we're in a big floating point container inside of Resolve, it's not like because you move your exposure, even something extreme, even if you go up 2 stops and you double your contrast ratio, like some crazy wackadoodle adjustment, it's not like then you'll have less room to move with your RGB. Generally speaking, I'm sure we could lab out and find exceptions to that, but you would have to drive the system really hard to make an adjustment with your exposure and contrast that would cause you to have less flexibility with your RGB balance, or vice versa for that matter. So it really just, to me, comes down to like, well, we know both are going to influence the other, so what's more important? Where should we start? What's more important to get right and get right first than second? And for me, just based on human biology, that points me to exposure and contrast, and then RGB balance, knowing that, yes, that's going to change the decisions that I make when I come to RGB balance, but it's not going to alter my ability to exact those changes on my image because I'm in a big, wide color gamut, big, wide dynamic range, and my floating point precision inside of the actual overall Resolve container is massive, so I'm not worried about bumping into walls, if that makes sense. But great question, and definitely fun stuff to think about when we're grading. Okay, guys. Another great grade school. Really enjoy you guys coming, or appreciate y'all coming out this morning. And I hope that somewhere in all that rambling, you got a new fresh idea or two to try out in your workflows. Let me know what you thought about this one in the comments. Let me know if you have follow-up questions. I'm always excited to see what questions or conclusions you guys come back with. Let me know. I'm also really curious to hear from y'all. How are you implementing the things that we're talking about? If you are getting stuff out of these conversations, what is it practically netting out for you? I would really love to hear that stuff, because it's just interesting to find out like what clicks for you guys and how it materially affects your workflow. So let me know in the comments any conclusions or changes that you're making in your workflow, or you know, like tangible benefits that you're seeing. That's always really, really exciting for me to hear. I'm really glad you guys could be here today, and we will see you very soon. Oh, last thing before we take off, Monday is the beginning of our Show LUT design course, my Show LUT design course with color training. You still got time to get signed up. I've had a couple folks ask me about like, what's the difference between this and the creative color science class that we just ran? And if I did one, should I do the other? To give a quick sort of summary there, creative color science is about advanced creative color science, basically about like how can we use tools outside of the realm of Resolve's color page to really, really articulate like advanced tools and looks within our grading environment. Show LUT design is much more about the object of a LUT itself, getting straight once and for all on what a LUT is, what a LUT isn't, how it works, the myths and half-truths and untruths about LUT, the LUTs that are floating around the internet all over the place these days, and getting clear once and for all on that. And I would encourage you guys, for what we're charging for the registration, that would be worth your time and money right there, because I promise you, I spent a lot more than that getting straight on that over the years, because there's so much misinformation out there around that. But things get really exciting once we get past that point, because we're only going to take a couple days to get past that point. And then the fun really begins, because we're going to start to figure out like, okay, well, we can make viewing LUTs for shooting in camera, so that we can equip our cinematographers, or equip ourselves if we're also working in production, to create a meaningful rendering of what the image will look like once it goes through the grade, as opposed to this meaningless rendering that has nothing to do with where I'm going to take it in the grade. So that's one example. We can create a creative LUT for ourselves that we can break out and use as a module or a piece within our grading workflow, kind of like the pieces I was showing you guys today, where we're saying, hey, I've got my LUT, I've got 20 hours or 200 hours or whatever of like creative research and development sunk into this thing, but now it's just a module that I can break out and drop onto my images whenever I please. That's really cool. So again, once we understand that baseline, we can start to explore the different applications of LUTs and how we can create LUTs that best support those different use cases. And we're going to have some great live sessions along the way. We're going to have a Discord channel that's going to be going and active for the whole 2 weeks. That's one of my favorite parts of the class, to see everyone talking with each other. And I love to jump in there and talk about like, hey, how would we creatively solve this? Or how could we implement this into our look? Or how could we sort of modulate that within our look dev, whatever we're doing. And the last thing I'll point out is that we're going to have a really, really special guest at the end of our time together during that session, Mr. Josh Pines, one of the absolute pioneers of using LUTs in post-production imaging pipelines, and an incredibly knowledgeable guy about image science who is going to talk to us about how we can marry up the use of LUTs to our creative intent and to its communication across these different phases of production and pieces of software and all that good jazz. So really don't want to miss the class. If you haven't signed up, or if you're on the fence, hopefully that kind of fills in some blanks for you guys. It's going to be a really fun 2 weeks. I'm really looking forward to seeing everybody there who does decide to join us. So if you haven't signed up for that, go check it out. And other than that, we will see you guys for the next episode of Grade School. Thanks to Gadali for being my co-host with the most, and I hope you guys have a great weekend. See you soon.